remember the day I was born in my past life, but I remember the day I met him. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to bring us together, as if every moment leading up to that day had been carefully arranged so that our eyes would meet across the bustling marketplace. The scent of fresh bread and dried herbs filled the air as merchants called out their prices. My silk sleeves brushed against wooden stalls as I walked, my maid trailing behind me, reminding me not to linger too long. But I wasn't listening. I was looking at him. He wasn't extraordinary by the standards of my world. He wasn't a prince, nor the son of a noble house. He was just a man, a scholar's son, his hands ink-stained, his posture poised but relaxed. He had deep brown eyes that held the weight of stories untold, and when he looked up and met my gaze, I felt something shift inside me. Recognition. It was absurd. I had never met him before. And yet it felt as though I knew him, as though we had spoken in another time, in another place. I didn't know then what that feeling meant. I only knew that I wanted to see him again. And I did. Again and again fate placed him in my path. At first it was nothing more than passing glances. Him at the bookshop, me seated in my family's carriage as we rode through town. Then small conversations, he would recommend a book and I would pretend I was interested in the words, when in truth all I wanted was to hear his voice. Then letters. Secret messages slipped between pages of books he knew I would read. He would write about the stars, about the way the rain smelled on quiet mornings, about how sometimes he felt as though he had lived another life before this one. And each time his words settled deep in my chest, as though he was speaking a language I had always known but had long forgotten. I had heard of love before. I had seen it in poems, read it in stories whispered by servants late at night. But I never understood it until him. It wasn't dramatic the way it was in the plays performed in the royal court. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was steady. A quiet, persistent knowing. The certainty that my soul belonged with his. But love, in the world I was born into, was not a choice. I was the daughter of a noble family. My fate had been written long before I took my first breath. I would marry a man of my father's choosing, one whose name carried wealth and influence. Love had no place in such arrangements. And so I was promised to another. A man who smiled but never truly saw me. A man whose hands were cold when they touched mine. A man who had never written me a single word of poetry, who had never looked at the stars and wondered about the vastness of the universe. I was to be his wife, bound by duty. And yet I had already given my heart to someone else. We tried to fight it. He told me that we could find a way, that we could leave, that love was worth risking everything for. And I wanted to believe him. I wanted to close my eyes and run into a future where we could be together, where love mattered more than bloodlines and alliances. The night before we were to escape, he held my hands beneath the glow of lanterns and whispered, "In another life I will find you. No matter how many lifetimes it takes." I should have known it was a farewell. I never saw him again. The news came the next morning. An accident, they said. A carriage overturned, a body found near the river. His hands had still been clutching a letter when they found him, a letter meant for me. A letter I never got to read. Something inside me shattered. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply existed, hollow and silent, as my parents arranged my wedding to a man I could never love. And so I married. I smiled in the way I was supposed to. I wore the silks and the jewels. I played the part of the devoted wife. I bore my husband's children, carried his name, fulfilled my duty. But my heart had died with him. And when my final breath came decades later, lying in a bed that had never truly felt like home, my last thought was not of my husband, nor of the life I had built. It was of him. His voice, his laughter, the promise he had made beneath the lantern light. In another life I will find you. And as the darkness took me, I whispered a prayer into the void. Let me find him again. The world around me faded, but I was not afraid. I had lived a long life. A life filled with obligations, expectations, and quiet suffering. A life where I had played the role I was given without question. But in the end, as I lay on my deathbed, I realized that it had never truly been mine. I had been a daughter, a wife, a mother, a dutiful woman of my time. But I had never truly been myself. Because he had been taken from me before I had ever been given the chance to choose love for myself. His name had remained unspoken on my lips for decades, locked away in the deepest part of me. But now, as my body grew weaker, as the last light of my life flickered in the dim glow of the oil lamp beside my bed, I allowed myself to remember. His voice. His touch. The way he had looked at me as though I was his entire world. I let my eyes drift shut, letting the memories take me back to the past, to the marketplace where we had first met, to the hidden corners of the library where we exchanged letters, to the night he had promised me that our love would transcend time itself. In another life I will find you. No matter how many lifetimes it takes. I had never truly believed in destiny before that moment. But now, as my final breath trembled on my lips, I made a vow. If there was another life, I would find him first. I would not let fate steal him from me again. The cold of the night faded into nothingness, and for the first time in years I felt at peace. And then I awoke. But not in the world I had known. Not in the body of an old woman, nor in the quiet dimness of my deathbed. I awoke to the sound of voices, laughter, the golden warmth of morning sunlight spilling through a window. My limbs felt light, my breath steady, my body unfamiliar. I was young. I gasped, sitting up abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest. My hands, smaller, softer, untouched by time, shook as I brought them to my face. My skin was smooth, my vision clear, my breath no longer labored. I was alive. But not as the woman I had been before. I stumbled to my feet, nearly collapsing as my mind flooded with memories that did not belong to me. The past life I had lived, the love I had lost, the death I had accepted. And yet, at the same time, there were new memories. A childhood spent in a different home, a family with different names, a body that was mine but not mine. I had been reborn. And suddenly I knew, this was my chance. Second life. A second chance to find him, to rewrite the story that had been so cruelly stolen from us. My heart pounded as the realization took hold. Somewhere in this world he was waiting for me. Somewhere he had also been reborn. I had to find him. It didn't matter what it took. No arranged marriage, no noble duties, no expectations from a family that would try to dictate my future. I was no longer bound by the rules of my past life. I had been given another chance. And this time I would not lose him again. Waking up in this new life should have been a moment of peace, a fresh start, a gift from the universe. But it was anything but that. The moment I took my first breath, I remembered everything. Not in pieces, not in flashes, but all at once. I remembered being a noblewoman in my past life. I remembered the weight of my family's expectations, the coldness of my arranged marriage, the way I had smiled and played the part of the perfect wife while my soul withered inside me. I remembered him, the love I had lost. The sound of his laughter, the warmth of his hands, the way he had looked at me like I was his entire world. I remembered his promise beneath the lantern-lit sky, the vow he had whispered into the night. In another life I will find you. And now I was here. Alive. Reborn. Given another chance. But where was he? For years I lived with that question haunting me. This life was nothing like my past one. I was born into an ordinary family, free from nobility, free from wealth and obligation. My parents were kind, my home simple but warm. My childhood was filled with laughter and love, things that should have been enough to make me happy. But the memories of my past life never faded. They clung to me like a shadow, whispering in the quiet moments, reminding me that this life was not meant to be lived for myself alone. I was born for a reason. To find him. I spent my early years watching everyone, searching for a sign, for anything that might tell me where he was. At first I thought it would be easy. Surely if I had been reborn, so had he. Surely fate would place us in each other's paths again, just as it had before. But the years passed and I found nothing. No familiar face. No eyes that sparked recognition in my soul. No whispered promise from the past returned to me. I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. What if he wasn't here? What if he had never been reborn? What if I was alone in this? I refused to believe it. I had come back, then so had he. I knew it in my bones, in the deepest part of my soul. He was out there. Somewhere. And I was going to find him. Even if it took my entire life. Years passed, and with every season that came and went, my hope flickered like a dying candle. At first I thought fate would lead me to him quickly, that I would simply feel his presence, the same way I had known him the moment I laid eyes on him in my past life. I imagined it happening in a crowded street, our gazes locking in an instant of recognition. I pictured us standing in a marketplace just as we had before, my heart skipping a beat as I whispered his name, only for him to turn and say mine in return. But reality was not so kind. I searched everywhere. I wandered through cities, studied the faces of strangers, hoping for even a flicker of familiarity. I listened to names, waiting for one to sound like an echo from another time. But days turned into months and months into years and he was nowhere. And worse, doubt began to creep in. What if he had not remembered our past the way I had? What if, even if I found him, he would be nothing more than a stranger, his soul untouched by the love we had once shared? What if I had been foolish to believe in this at all? There were moments when I almost let myself move on. I tried to silence the memories, to embrace this life as though it was a new beginning, not a continuation of the one I had lost. But deep down I knew the truth. I had not been reborn to forget. I had been reborn to find him. And then one evening when I had almost given up hope, I saw him. It was in the city square during the Festival of Lanterns. The streets were alive with golden light, the night sky flickering with floating wishes, each one carrying a hope, a dream, a silent prayer. I was standing among the crowd, lost in thought when I felt it. A pull. A sensation so strong that I stopped breathing, my entire body going still. And then I turned. And there he was. My heart stopped. He was standing across the plaza, surrounded by friends, laughing at something someone had said. The lantern glow illuminated his face, casting a warm light over his features. And even though this was a new life, a different time, a different world, it was him. His hair was different now, shorter and slightly tousled. His posture was more confident, his expression brighter, as though this life had been kinder to him than the last. But his eyes, those deep soulful brown eyes, were exactly the same. And I knew. I had spent years searching, dreaming of this moment, telling myself I would be ready. But standing there, my heart in my throat, I realized I wasn't. What if he didn't recognize me? What if he had moved on, if his soul had forgotten ours had once been intertwined? What if I had been alone in this all along? My breath came fast and shallow as he turned, his gaze sweeping over the festival, and for one agonizing second, I thought he would pass right over me. But then he stopped. His eyes locked onto mine, and something shifted. His smile faltered, his laughter fading into silence. His expression changed, not recognition, not entirely, but confusion. As if he had just seen a glimpse of something he couldn't understand, as if something buried deep within him was stirring for the first time. For a long moment we just stared at each other. I wanted to say his name. I wanted to run to him, to shake him, to tell him everything. But I couldn't. Because this was not the past. And even though my heart was screaming that he was mine, that we had once loved so deeply it had transcended death itself, I knew I had to be careful. He didn't remember. Not yet. But I had found him. And this time I would not lose him again. No matter what it took. Finding him was supposed to be the hardest part. For years, I had searched for him, for a sign, for anything that would confirm that our souls were still bound by the promise we made in our past lives. And then there he was, standing under the lantern-lit sky, his face familiar even in this new body, his presence sending a deep, undeniable pull through me. But fate had other plans. When I saw him that night, I thought, this is it. This is the moment he remembers me. That the second our eyes met, recognition would flood through him, the memories of our past life breaking through the barriers of time. That he would say my name, not the name I had in this life but the one I carried in my past, and that he would know. But he didn't. Instead, he only blinked at me, his brows furrowing slightly in confusion, as if he had seen something he couldn't quite place. His lips parted as if a question lingered there, but before he could say anything, another voice called his name. A woman's voice. And then she appeared. She moved beside him effortlessly, sliding her hand into his as if she had done it 1,000 times before. She was beautiful, long dark hair cascading down her back, her features elegant and poised. She had the kind of presence that demanded attention, the kind of confidence that made it clear she belonged at his side. I felt my heart stop. She turned to him, speaking softly, and he smiled at her. A soft, familiar smile, one that sent a sharp pain through my chest. And that's when I saw it, the ring on her finger. She wasn't just someone in his life. She was his fiancé. My vision blurred, the sounds of the festival fading into nothing. I wanted to step forward, to shake him, to beg him to remember. To tell him that this wasn't right, that this wasn't how our story was supposed to go. But what right did I have? In this life I was a stranger to him. And he was engaged to someone else. I forced myself to breathe, to stay still, to not run. Because even though he didn't remember me, I remembered everything. And I knew him. The man standing in front of me. no matter how different his life was now, no matter who he had become, was still him. The way his fingers brushed against his temple when he was thinking. The way his shoulders tensed ever so slightly when someone called his name unexpectedly. The way his voice lowered when he spoke to the woman beside him, as if instinctively protecting her from the noise of the world. I had spent an entire lifetime loving him. I couldn't walk away, so I made a decision. If he did not remember me, then I would stay by his side until he did. I wouldn't force the past on him. I wouldn't tell him who I had been, who we had been. Not yet. But I would not let this life slip away from us. I would stay close. I would make him feel it. The pull, the connection, the part of him that still belonged to me, even if he didn't understand why. I would make him remember. Because no matter what fate had done to twist our story, I refused to let history repeat itself. I had lost him once. I would not lose him again. Walking away was never an option. Not this time. I had lost him once before, felt the agony of knowing that our love had been torn apart by fate, by forces beyond our control. I had been powerless then, bound by the rules of a life I hadn't chosen, trapped in a destiny that had never been mine. But this time I had a choice. And I chose him. Even if he didn't remember me. Even if, in this life, he looked at me with polite curiosity instead of longing. Even if another woman stood at his side, wearing his ring, holding the place that should have been mine. I would not let go. I learned his name in this life. Elias. It wasn't the same as the one he had carried before, but somehow it still felt like him. I began to watch him closely, not in a way that would make him suspicious, but enough to learn who he had become. He was still intelligent, still thoughtful, still carried that quiet strength I had fallen in love with in our past life. But he was different too. This Elias had grown up in a privileged family, raised to inherit a future filled with responsibilities and expectations. He carried himself with confidence, with certainty, with the ease of someone who had never had to fight for his place in the world. He was a businessman, a leader, someone who had everything planned for him. And I was no longer a noblewoman bound by duty. In this life I was no one special, just an ordinary woman living in the same city, working an unremarkable job, blending into the crowd. It should have meant that our worlds wouldn't cross. But I wouldn't let fate keep us apart this time. I found out where he worked, an elegant corporate building in the heart of the city. I told myself it wasn't stalking, it was strategy. The company he worked for was hosting an open seminar and I took my chance. I signed up as a participant, knowing it was my best shot at getting close without raising suspicion. And then on the day of the event it happened. I stood at the back of the hall watching him as he walked onto the stage. He was dressed sharply, his posture exuding authority, but the moment he spoke, I felt the past wrap around me like a ghost. It was him. The way he gestured with his hands when he was passionate about something. The slight crease in his brow when he was deep in thought. The warmth in his voice, even when discussing something as mundane as business strategies. I knew him. My body knew him. My soul knew him. And then, as if the universe had willed it, his eyes found mine in the audience. He faltered just for a second. It was barely noticeable, a fleeting moment of hesitation before he continued speaking, but I saw it. Something inside him recognized me. He didn't know why. He didn't understand it. But he had felt it just as I had. When the seminar ended, I made my move. As the guests mingled, I approached him carefully, deliberately, as though this was just a casual encounter between two strangers. "Your speech was impressive," I said, offering him a small smile. He turned to me, his deep brown eyes meeting mine up close for the first time in this life. There was again that flicker of something. He smiled politely. "Thank you. Have we met before?" My heart skipped. "Not yet," I wanted to say. Instead, I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "I don't think so." For a moment he just looked at me as if trying to place me in his memories, as if his soul was whispering that he should know me. I had him. Now I just had to keep pulling him in. I started showing up in places he frequented. Not in an obvious way, never too often, never too conveniently. But just enough for him to notice me. Just enough for our paths to cross naturally, for him to start recognizing me outside of that one seminar. A coffee shop near his office. A bookstore he liked. An art gallery where I knew he occasionally attended events. Each time I played it the same way. Casual. Unintentional. And each time I saw it. The way he hesitated when he saw me, the way he would pause for just a fraction of a second before greeting me, as if something about me unsettled him. As if his soul was whispering to him, trying to remind him of something he couldn't quite grasp. And slowly it worked. He started approaching me. First it was small. "Oh, we meet again. Funny running into you here. You seem to have good taste in coffee shops." And then one day something changed. We were at a quiet bookstore, standing in the same aisle, both reaching for the same book at the same time. Our fingers brushed. A simple touch. A spark shot through me, a jolt of something so familiar that I had to grip the shelf to steady myself. And then, him. His breath hitched. His fingers lingered against mine for just a second too long. His eyes darkened, his expression shifting into something unreadable. "I don't know why," he murmured almost to himself, "but I feel like I've met you before." My heart pounded. Yes. I wanted to scream it, to shake him, to make him remember. But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I had to be patient. I had to let him find his way back to me naturally. Because if I pushed too hard, if I told him everything before he was ready, I might lose him again. And this time I refused to let fate take him from me. I would stay by his side. I would make him remember. No matter how long it took. The more time I spent around Elias, the more I saw it. The glimpses of the man I had loved in another life. It was in the way his gaze lingered on me for just a second too long, as if his mind was trying to piece together a puzzle it didn't even realize was incomplete. It was in the way he always seemed to find me in a crowd, his eyes searching for me even when we weren't supposed to be near each other. It was in the way he spoke to me, not like a stranger but like someone who already knew me, even if he didn't understand why. But there were bigger signs, ones he couldn't ignore. At first they came in small, fleeting moments. The time we reached for the same book in the store, our hands brushing, and he suddenly stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. The way he hesitated whenever I said his name, as if expecting it to be different, as if his heart recognized a name that his lips had never spoken in this life. The strange way his body reacted to mine, like instinct, like familiarity, like something buried deep in his bones was waking up. But then something deeper began to shift. One evening we found ourselves walking together, a casual encounter that had somehow turned into an unplanned moment of solitude. The sky was dark, the streets lit by the soft glow of streetlights, and the city hummed with quiet life around us. He was talking, laughing about something, but then out of nowhere he stopped, turned to me. His brows knitted together, his lips parting slightly as if he was trying to say something, but couldn't quite find the words. Then softly, "Have we met before?" My breath caught. I had been waiting for this. Carefully I tilted my head, offering a small smile. "We've run into each other a lot lately," I said lightly. "Maybe you just feel like you know me." He shook his head. "No. It's different." He hesitated, frowning as if frustrated with himself. "It's strange, but when I look at you I feel like I should know you. Like I'm supposed to remember something, but I can't." My heart pounded. "Yes, Elias. You're supposed to remember. We were never meant to be strangers." But I couldn't tell him that. Not yet. So instead I asked, "And how does that make you feel?" He exhaled, rubbing a hand through his hair. "I don't know. It's like a dream that I can't quite grasp. Like I know there's something important, something just out of reach, but no matter how hard I try to focus on it, it slips away." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe it'll come back to you when you're ready." He studied me for a long moment, and for a second I thought he would say something that would confirm what I already knew. But then he shook his head as if brushing off the thought. "It's probably nothing," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Maybe I'm just overthinking." But we both knew it wasn't nothing. Not long after, I began noticing something else. Elias was losing sleep. I saw it in the way he carried himself. His shoulders slightly tenser, the faint dark circles under his eyes. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off, claiming he had been working late. But then one day as we sat at our usual cafe, he let something slip. "I keep having these weird dreams," he admitted, stirring his coffee absently. "They don't make sense, but they feel real." I froze. "What kind of dreams?" He sighed, shaking his head. "It's hard to explain. I keep seeing places I don't recognize. People I don't know. But they feel familiar, like I should remember them. And then there's this girl." My fingers curled tightly around my cup. I held my breath. "A girl?" He nodded slowly. "I don't know her face, but she's always there. I can hear her voice, but the moment I wake up I can never remember what she was saying. It's like she's trying to tell me something important, but I just..." He exhaled in frustration, rubbing his temple. I don't know why I'm even telling you this. Because it's me, Elias. It's me in your dreams. But all I said was, maybe you should listen to her. His eyes met mine then, searching as if trying to figure something out. For the briefest moment I saw something flicker in his expression. Something like recognition. Then just as quickly it was gone. The more time we spent together, the more undeniable it became. Even when we weren't speaking, we would find ourselves drawn to each other. His body angled toward mine when we sat together, his gaze seeking me out across rooms, his presence gravitating toward me even when neither of us intended it. It was magnetic. Unspoken. Like an invisible thread tying us together, pulling tighter with every encounter. And the moments of déjà vu, the instances where his fingers brushed against mine and he tensed as if shocked, the way he sometimes said something and then looked confused as if wondering why the words felt so familiar, became more frequent. But no matter how much he felt it, no matter how much I knew his soul recognized mine, his mind still didn't understand. And then, just when I thought I was making progress, she appeared. She had always been there, lingering in the background, the woman fate had placed in his life in this world. But I had convinced myself that it didn't matter, that the bond we shared was stronger than the artificial ties that held them together. But now she was paying attention. She saw what I had seen. The way he was drawn to me, the way his body reacted when I was near, the way his soul was waking up little by little. And she did not like it. Her voice was sharp when she spoke to me, her words coated with forced politeness. You seem to be spending a lot of time around Elias. I met her gaze, steady and unwavering. We've become friends. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Yes. Friends. A warning. I should have been scared. I should have backed away. But I had already lost him once before. And I refused to lose him again. I didn't care what she did. I didn't care what fate tried to throw at us. Because Elias was mine. And I would make him remember no matter what it took. He knew. From the moment she first saw the way Elias looked at me, the flickers of recognition he didn't understand, the way his body instinctively leaned toward mine, the pauses in his breath when our fingers brushed, she knew. She didn't have the memories of a past life. She didn't hear the whispers of destiny weaving between us. But she wasn't blind. She saw the pull between Elias and me, the invisible thread that neither of us could sever, the way his soul reached for mine even though he had no words for it. And she hated it. Because she was supposed to be the one he loved in this life. She was the one wearing his ring, the one his family had chosen, the one who had stood beside him long before I entered the picture. But I was undoing all of that. Without trying, without meaning to, I was unraveling the reality she had built with him. And she was not going to let that happen. It started small. Subtle glances from across the room. Polite smiles that didn't reach her eyes. The careful way she positioned herself between Elias and me whenever we were in the same space. At first I thought I was imagining it. But then one afternoon she cornered me. I had been sitting alone at the cafe Elias and I often visited, my fingers tracing the rim of my coffee cup, lost in thought. The sound of heels clicking against the floor pulled me back to the present. And then she was there, sliding into the seat across from me, uninvited. I looked up, meeting her gaze. Her expression was calm, unreadable, but there was something sharp in her eyes. Something deliberate. Do you know what I hate the most? She asked smoothly, stirring the tea in front of her as if we were simply two friends chatting over drinks. I didn't respond. I only watched her, waiting. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I hate women who don't understand boundaries. I inhaled slowly, keeping my expression neutral. Is there something you'd like to say to me? Her lips curled upward, amusement flashing across her face. You're very clever, aren't you? I can see why he likes you. She tilted her head. But you and I both know that Elias is already taken. I tightened my grip on my cup. This was a warning. She wanted me to back off, to disappear from his life, to leave him in her hands. But she didn't understand. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction. This wasn't something I could walk away from. We were bound together, across time, across lifetimes. I met her gaze, my voice calm. I think Elias is capable of deciding who he wants in his life. Her smile didn't falter, but her grip on her spoon tightened ever so slightly. Then she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. You have no idea what I'm willing to do to keep him. And with that she stood, smoothing out her dress as if she hadn't just issued a threat, then walked away, leaving me sitting there, my heart pounding. After that day things started changing. It was subtle at first. Elias began hesitating before replying to my messages. He still sought me out, still looked at me with that quiet longing he couldn't understand, but there was doubt in his eyes now, hesitation that hadn't been there before. And I knew where it was coming from. She was whispering in his ear, feeding him lies. I don't think she's who she pretends to be. Don't you think it's strange how she suddenly appeared in your life? She's manipulating you. She just wants something from you. I could see it, the battle inside him. His heart pulled him toward me, but his mind was filled with questions. And then she did something I hadn't expected. She made him choose. One evening Elias called me. His voice was quiet, almost tired. Can we meet? I knew something was wrong before I even arrived. We met at a small park, one that overlooked the city skyline, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. He was already there when I arrived, standing near the railing, staring out into the distance. When he turned to look at me, I felt my heart sink. Because for the first time since I had found him, I saw walls in his eyes. What's wrong? I asked carefully. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to think anymore. A sharp pain stabbed through my chest. I stepped closer. Elias, talked to me. He exhaled. She told me something. Something I can't get out of my head. Of course she had. I already knew what it was before he even said it. She said I need to make a choice. His voice was almost pained. Between you and her. I sucked in a breath. This was it. She had backed him into a corner, forced him to choose between the life he thought he had built and the truth that was waking inside him. And even though I knew that his soul belonged to mine, fear gripped me. Because what if this life wasn't enough? What if the doubts she planted were stronger than the pull of our love? What if I had found him only to lose him again? I swallowed hard. And what do you want? His jaw tightened. That's just it, I don't know. Liar. He did know. I saw it in the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides, in the way he was looking at me as if he was afraid of his own feelings. He felt it. He had always felt it. But he was scared. And I understood why. Because choosing me would mean walking into something unknown. It would mean believing in something he didn't yet understand, trusting emotions that had no logical explanation. And choosing her? It would be safe. Predictable. The life he had always expected to have. I took a slow, steady breath. I'm not going to beg you, Elias. My voice was soft but firm. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I will say this. Whatever you're feeling, whatever questions you have, don't ignore them. He looked at me, something raw in his gaze. You know me, I whispered. Even if you don't remember why. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then finally he closed his eyes and exhaled. I need time, he murmured. I nodded. Because for now time was all I could give him. But I would wait. Because I had already waited a lifetime for him. And I wasn't about to stop now. I had spent this lifetime searching for Elias and I had finally found him. I had watched as his soul recognized mine in ways he couldn't understand, felt the way he was drawn to me, and I had seen the war inside him. The battle between the life he had been given and the love that fate had written into his soul. But fate had never been kind to us. And just as it seemed that I was breaking through, just when I thought that this time would be different, everything fell apart again. Days passed after his confession. After he admitted he didn't know what to do. After he admitted he felt something but couldn't understand it. I gave him space. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. Every part of me wanted to stay close, to remind him of the love he had forgotten, to make him see what was right in front of him. But I knew he needed to come to it on his own. He needed to choose me not because I forced him, but because his heart remembered even when his mind didn't. And then one evening my phone rang. It was late. Too late for a casual call. My heart pounded as I picked up, and the moment I heard the voice on the other end, I knew. It wasn't Elias. It was one of his friends. And they were saying something I couldn't process, something that made my hands go numb and my breath hitch in my throat. An accident. A car accident. A collision on the highway. A wreck. No one knew exactly what happened, but Elias was in the hospital, unconscious. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. Because this was exactly how I had lost him before. I didn't remember how I got there. One moment I was frozen in place, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. The next I was running through the cold hallways of the hospital, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I saw his fiancé first. She was sitting in the waiting area, her hands shaking, her face pale. The moment she saw me, something flickered across her expression. Shock, anger, maybe even fear. She had been so focused on keeping me out of his life, on making sure I never got too close. But now we were both here. Because now it wasn't about choosing anymore. It was about whether he would even wake up at all. She stood as I approached, and for a moment I thought she would tell me to leave. That she would throw one final warning my way, demand that I stay away. But instead she just looked at me, her eyes empty. "Do you even understand?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "If he doesn't wake up, none of this will even matter." I didn't answer her. I just pushed past her, needing to see him. The sight of him in that hospital bed nearly shattered me. Cooked, fragile. The strong, confident man I had chased across time lay still, unmoving, machines beeping quietly around him. There were bandages on his head, bruises on his arms. The steady rise and fall of his chest was the only sign that he was still here at all. I swallowed the lump in my throat, moving slowly toward him. My fingers shook as I reached out, brushing against his hand, the same hands I had held in another life, the same hands that had once written me love letters, the same hands that had promised me he would find me again. And now he was slipping away. A tear slipped down my cheek, my chest tightening. "No," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Not again. Not like this." I wasn't losing him again. I wasn't going to watch him slip through my fingers like sand, wasn't going to let fate rip him away from me a second time. I leaned in, my forehead resting lightly against his hand, closing my eyes. "Please," I murmured, my voice barely a breath. "If you can hear me, come back to me." I squeezed his fingers. I waited. Nothing. That night I fell asleep in the chair beside his bed. And I dreamed. But it wasn't like normal dreams. It was him. Not Elias as he was now, but him as he had been before. His past self, the man I had loved in another time. We were standing beneath the lanterns again, just like we had been on the last night I had seen him alive in our past life. He was holding my hands, his gaze filled with something desperate. "You found me," he whispered. I swallowed hard. "Yes." His fingers tightened around mine. "I knew you would." Tears burned in my eyes. "Then why can't you remember?" He exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment as if pained. "Because fate is cruel." I shook my head. "I won't accept that. I won't lose you again." He cupped my face, his touch warm and familiar. "You have to wake me up." I blinked. "What?" He leaned in, his lips brushing against my forehead. "Wake me up," he whispered. And then I jolted awake. I gasped, sitting up so fast the chair nearly tipped over. The room was quiet, dimly lit. Elias hadn't moved. But his fingers were twitching. I sucked in a sharp breath, my heart slamming against my ribs. Slowly his eyelids fluttered. Then finally his eyes opened. For a long moment he just stared at the ceiling, his breathing uneven. Then slowly his gaze turned toward me. And the second his eyes met mine, I knew. Something had changed. Because for the first time in this life he looked at me like he knew me. Truly knew me. And then in a hoarse, barely there whisper he spoke. A name. Not my name in this life. But the one I had carried in my past. The one I thought he had forgotten. And just like that, he remembered. The moment Elias whispered my past name, the world around us seemed to stop. I had been waiting for this, praying for this. For so long, I had wondered if he would ever remember, if all the signs, all the moments, all the pull between us would be enough to awaken what fate had buried deep inside him. And now it had happened. His lips barely moved, his voice weak from exhaustion, but I heard it as if he had shouted it into the universe. The name I had carried in my past life. The name only he had ever spoken with such reverence, such love. Tears burned my eyes as I gripped his hand, my fingers trembling against his. "Arias." My voice broke, my heart hammering. "You remember me?" His breathing was uneven, his brow furrowing as though he was piecing together the memories unraveling in his mind. His lips parted, but no words came at first, just a quiet exhale, like he was trying to grasp something just beyond reach. Then softly he murmured, "It was you. It's always been you." A sob caught in my throat. He knew. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't chasing a love that had only existed in my own heart. He knew me. But before I could even process the enormity of what had just happened, the door to his hospital room slammed open. And she was there. His fiancé. The second she stepped inside, her eyes locked onto me, dark and stormy with fury. She must have been standing outside, watching, waiting, knowing that she was losing him. "You," she hissed, her voice shaking. "What are you doing here?" I barely looked at her. I couldn't. All I could see was Elias. His gaze flickered between us, his face paling as realization dawned on him. He had been caught between us before, unsure, hesitant, trapped in doubt. But not anymore. Because this time he knew. I saw it in his eyes. The walls that had been built in this lifetime were crumbling, the weight of our past pressing into his soul. He wasn't just Elias anymore. He was the man I had loved then and the man I loved now, colliding into one. His fiancée moved to his side, gripping his arm like she could somehow anchor him to the life she had built around him. "Elias," she whispered urgently, her voice laced with desperation. "You know me. You chose me." He didn't speak. His hand tightened around mine instead. Her entire body tensed. "Elias," she tried again, "this woman is manipulating you. She's poisoning you." His gaze snapped to her then, sharp, clear, resolute. "No," he said, his voice stronger than before. "She's reminding me." A heavy silence filled the room. Her face twisted, her grip on him tightening. "What does that even mean?" she demanded. "What has she been telling you?" "Lies. Fairy tales." Elias inhaled deeply, his fingers curling around mine like a lifeline. He sat up a little, ignoring the pain that still lingered in his body. "I remember," he said quietly. "Not just her. Not just this life. I remember everything." Her face drained of color. I could almost hear the sound of her world shattering. Because she knew then she had lost him. She had spent so long fighting to keep him, to keep me away, but fate had already written its decision. And this time I refused to let it take him from me. She left. Not without another bitter glare in my direction. Not without the sharp intake of breath that told me she wanted to scream, to break something, to demand that this wasn't fair. But she left. And when the door closed behind her, I turned back to Elias, afraid to speak, afraid that if I said the wrong thing, if I breathed too loudly, the spell would break. But he only stared at me, his gaze filled with so many emotions I could barely stand it. Slowly, carefully, he lifted a hand, brushing his fingertips against my cheek. "You waited for me," he murmured. A tear slipped down my face and I nodded. "Always." A slow, almost disbelieving smile curved his lips. "I can't believe I forgot you." I let out a shaky laugh, pressing my forehead against his. "You didn't. Not really. You were always finding your way back to me." His breath hitched. Then, softly, he said the words I had waited lifetimes to hear. "I love you." I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply, letting those words wrap around my heart like a promise. "I love you too," I whispered back. This time I would not lose him. This time fate would not tear us apart. This time we would fight back against the universe itself. Together. Elias had finally remembered. For so long, I had carried the weight of our past alone, the burden of knowing that we were meant to be together while he remained trapped in a life that had been written for him. But now the wall between us had crumbled and his soul had awakened. He saw me, not just as the woman he had met in this life, but as the one he had loved before. And I saw him. Not just as Elias, but as the man I had loved across time, the man whose hands I had once held in secret, the man who had whispered promises to me beneath the lantern-lit sky in a world long lost to time. We had been given a second chance. But fate was not done with us yet. Now that he knew, now that everything was clear, there was no turning back. But remembering was only the beginning. The life Elias had built in this world was not one he could walk away from easily. He was engaged, his family's future tied to the woman who had fought so hard to keep him by her side. His company, his obligations, everything was tangled in a web that had been carefully spun for years. And then there was me, the woman who had appeared out of nowhere, threatening to unravel everything. The whispers had already started. People began to talk about the way Elias had changed, about the woman who was always seen near him, about the tension between him and his fiancée. And she, his fiancée, was not going to let him go without a fight. I had expected her to lash out, to make a scene, to throw everything she had at me in one final desperate attempt to hold on to him. But she didn't. Instead, she played her final card in the most painful way possible. He went to his family. Elias had been raised in a world of tradition, of expectations, of duty. His family was powerful, respected, and deeply invested in the life he was meant to lead. And now they saw me as a threat. They called him to a private meeting, a room filled with stern voices and sharp gazes. "Think about what you're doing," his father warned, his voice laced with authority. "Do you truly believe this woman is worth throwing away your entire future?" Elias stood tall, unwavering. "Yes," he said simply. His mother's expression was one of deep disappointment. "Elias, this isn't love. This is a fantasy. A passing obsession." His fiancé was there too, silent, watching with cold satisfaction as his own family tried to tear him away from me. "You're making a mistake," his father pressed. "She is nothing compared to what you have." Elias clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "She is everything." A heavy silence fell over the room. His father exhaled sharply. "Then you leave us no choice." And just like that, Elias lost everything. The news spread quickly. Elias had walked away from the empire his family had built, from the wealth, the connections, the power that had always been his for the taking. They cut him off completely. Everything he had once known, the security, the stability, the privilege, was gone. And yet, when he looked at me, there was no regret in his eyes. He had made his choice. Not out of recklessness, not out of blind impulse, but because he had finally remembered what truly mattered. "You were worth it then," he murmured one night as we sat together beneath the stars. "And you're worth it now." Tears pricked my eyes as I reached for his hand. "I would have waited for you forever." He smiled, pressing a kiss to my fingers. "You don't have to anymore." Because this time fate had no power over us. We had rewritten our story. And we had won. Elias and I had defied fate. In our past life, we had been torn apart by forces beyond our control. By duty, by circumstance, by tragedy. We had been bound by the rules of a world that never gave us the chance to choose love over obligation. But in this life we had fought back. We had faced every obstacle, every attempt to keep us apart. We had stood against expectations, against the weight of the past, against the lingering shadow of a destiny that had once failed us. And this time we won. Elias had lost everything. His family had cut him off. His fiancée had walked away, leaving behind nothing but bitter words and broken ties. The world he had known had crumbled beneath his feet the moment he chose me. But for the first time he was free. And so was I. We left the city behind, leaving behind the echoes of our past, the whispered rumors, the tangled history that had tried to keep us apart. We built a new life, far from the expectations that had once trapped us. A life that belonged to us and no one else. And every day I saw it in Elias. The way he breathed easier, the way he laughed more, the way his hands found mine without hesitation. He had been given a second chance just like I had. And this time he chose love. One evening, as we sat together beneath a sky full of stars, Elias turned to me with a quiet expression, his fingers tracing idle patterns against my skin. "I keep remembering more," he murmured. I looked at him, my heart swelling. "Tell me." He hesitated for a moment as if unsure how to put it into words. Then softly, "I remember the first time I saw you. In our past life." A sharp breath caught in my throat. "You were standing in the marketplace," he continued, his voice laced with something tender, something raw. "Your hair was pinned up, but the wind kept pulling strands loose. And I remember thinking, she looks familiar." A tear slipped down my cheek. "You did recognize me," I whispered. He smiled faintly. "I just didn't know why." I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around his. "And now?" His gaze locked onto mine, steady and certain. "Now I know. And I'll never forget again." His lips found mine then, soft and lingering, sealing the promise we had waited lifetimes to fulfill. Some people believe that love is fleeting, that it fades with time, that it can be lost. But I know better. Because I had lived it. I had searched across lifetimes, fought against fate itself, refused to let time erase what was meant to be. And in the end, love had won. Because Elias and I were not just lovers in this life. We had been lovers before. And we would be lovers again. No matter how many lifetimes it took. No matter what obstacles stood in our way. We would always find each other. Because some love stories aren't meant to end. They are meant to last forever.